Hello and welcome to another Thursday here on Viking.TV. I'm Anne Diamond, and every week I bring you somebody fascinating to meet. And my guest this week, well, will not disappoint. He is a compulsive read. His books are described as unputdownable, if that's a word. And they make good movies too. He selects some of the best backdrops you can imagine, epic moments in history, amazing eras that still define our society today, and wars and battles and politics. And he inserts into that intrigues and plots and characters and dramas of his own making, a pretty powerful mix that results in global bestseller after global bestseller. He's well known for his painstaking research, something he clearly loves, and which takes him to extraordinary places, such as, have a look at this, Hitler's bedroom. Yeah, that is actually Hitler's bedroom. And there he is on the balcony outside Hitler's apartment. And then he's been to places like the ruins of Pompeii and the awesome splendor, of course, of the Vatican. We'll find out more about all of that later. If you don't know his face that well, you'll certainly recognize his books, from Fatherland through the Cicero trilogy, from Enigma to The Ghostwriter, both of those made into great movies. And now he has another #1 bestseller. It tells the story of the V2 rockets that were designed to rain havoc and destruction and death on London in the final part of World War II. And again, it is unputdownable, though I will briefly put it down, to welcome my next guest. He is the author Robert Harris, who joins us now from his study in his home here in the UK. Welcome, Robert.
Hi, Anne. Nice to see you.
It's lovely to see you. I love your study. Are those all your books behind you?
Well, I own them. I didn't write them.
I think you wrote an awful lot of them, actually.
Well, yeah, sometimes it feels as though I did, but I didn't actually.
How are you getting on? Are you? I mean, we're in lockdown at the moment here in Britain, so you've got a rather comfortable place to be locked down. But have you been busy?
Yes, I mean, I'd started writing V2 when the lockdown came in. I'd written about a quarter of it. And then for about sort of 3 weeks, I was paralyzed and hardly able to do anything as the world seemed to, teeter towards oblivion. And then I sort of pulled myself together and thought, well, I might as well get something out of this period. And so I put my head down and I did actually finish the novel, which came out in Britain in September. And now, as you say, we're locked down again. So there's nothing for it but to start writing another. So, I mean, if I go on at this rate, I'd have written 50 books by the time I've finished.
But that's brilliant. You're obviously very productive. You must be disciplined. Are you a disciplined writer?
Yes, I am quite. I was a journalist for a long time, both in television and then I went into newspapers. And particularly in newspapers, I learned the importance of a deadline. It was strange. I used to write columns, and always the columns that I spent weeks preparing or researching were not very good. And the ones I had to make up on the spot, quickly to meet the deadline, were always much better. And I became rather hooked on deadlines because I think that you get a bit of adrenaline then, and you see things which you otherwise wouldn't see. So I try to write my novels in 6 months. I start them in January, finish them at the end of June, and they come out in the autumn.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. But normally, I mean, you say as a journalist, you usually have to have somebody shouting at you, shouting the deadline at you. But you obviously are disciplined enough to keep to your own schedule.
Well, it's fear and the overdraft, the mortgage, all that keeps you going.
Yeah.
And a certain professional pride or whatever. You don't want to let people down. The publishers are expecting it. The booksellers are expecting it. And I find that, stimulates me, it spurs me on. So that's generally the way in which I work.
Tell us about this. I'm about halfway through and it's riveting. I mean, it is absolutely what they say about you, or you are unputdownable. I'm finding it absolutely fascinating, and I wouldn't have thought I'd be very interested in a rocket, but it's so much more than that. Can you tell us, just in case there are people watching at the moment who don't really understand or don't remember the history of the V2, what were they? Why were they built? Why? I presume it was Hitler's last push at just trying to beat the odds.
Yes, I mean, came across the story. Well, I tell you what, in fact, today because I was sitting in my study here, I tore out, I literally only found this morning, from the Times 4 years ago. Can you see this is an obituary of a woman called Eileen Younghusband. And it says here, WAF officer, Women's Royal Air Force officer, who used her mathematical skills to track down Hitler's V2 rocket sites. And it was, I saw that 4 years ago, and I just thought, she sounds an interesting character. And indeed she was. It's the most extraordinary story. The V2 was, as you say, is a ballistic missile fired at London between September 1944 and March 1945, 1,300 ballistic missiles fired at Britain, and they damaged or destroyed 600,000 buildings actually in Britain, and there was no way of stopping them. They travelled at 3,500 miles an hour. They were launched from the coast of Holland, carrying a 1-ton warhead, and they hit London 5 minutes later. There was simply no way of stopping them. You can see on the screen there, that was the technology that eventually became the Saturn rocket that landed men on the moon, and they were built by Werner von Braun. And I was attracted to the story by these 8 women who were sent to newly liberated Belgium to try and track the missiles so that they could find their point of origin. The mobile launchers, they were fired from the Dutch coast at London. And I also was interested in the impact within living memory. You know, there are people around now, 76 years ago this happened, who remember the incoming rockets. And it just struck me as extraordinary, so modern, within living memory, one European power occupying another, firing ballistic missiles at the capital city of a third, and these women struggling to try and stop them. I just thought it just intrigued me, and eventually I came to write the novel about it.
My goodness, they were destructive too, because I was looking on the inside. Lovely, lovely book, when it's got nice touchy feelingness. But if you look at the inside there, picture of a part of London I know very well, work in, but all of the black are totally destroyed places. I mean, it was a part of London that was, I mean, almost completely razed to the ground with these horrifying rockets.
Yeah, they were a very crude weapon. I mean, they were. It was the most stupendous piece of technology. It was probably the most sophisticated piece of technology on the planet, actually. But it was inaccurate, you know. And the Germans used to fire them at Charing Cross, was the aiming point, which was considered the geographical heart of London. So the novel opens with a missile hitting Holborn, between the Inns of Court, Chancery Lane. This is an actual attack that happened on a Saturday morning at the end of November 1944, which of course is quite close to Charing Cross. So the area around there, it did get quite a lot of hits. But by and large, these missiles, anything within 5-mile radius of Charing Cross station was considered on target. And a lot of them went, you know, they went all over the place. They landed in the North Sea. They overshot London completely and landed in St Albans. A lot of them fell in South London or Kent. I mean, it was a very unreliable weapon, and a lot of them blew up over the Hague or over the North Sea.
Yes, and there's a remarkable scene where you do go into some of the mistakes that were made, and the fact that sometimes they never actually got off the ground. They just exploded. They were very dangerous things to be near, even from the German point of view, weren't they?
Yeah, I mean, the novel has 2 characters. I mean, the point of writing historical fiction, as opposed to history, is that you have the license to invent people. And the moment you invent people, you switch on other things in the reader's mind. They become invested in a character. What do they do? What's happening to them? You see things through their eyes. So I have an English WAF officer who goes to Belgium to try and stop these missiles, and I have a German engineer he's still a young man, but who's worked with Werner von Braun, developing the rocket at Peenemünde, and now has been sent to the woods near The Hague to fire them at London. And it's through his eyes that we see it, and through his eyes that we experience, you know, the danger of handling these things. You know, they were tricky things.
And as I say, you get invested in the characters because you actually do care what happens to them, and you get caught up in their story. Why do you think we are still so interested in some of these untold stories of World War II? It's a long time
Well,
now, isn't it?
it is, but it is still within living memory, just. Our world is very much shaped by the Second World War, politically, geopolitically, in terms of technology. As you were saying earlier in your introduction, I wrote a novel, Enigma, which is about Bletchley Park, the birthplace of the computer. Peenemünde, which is in V2, that was the birthplace of the rocket. And then in Los Alamos, it was the birthplace of atomic technology. And in these three places, Bletchley Park, Peenemünde, and Los Alamos, these were the three crucibles that forged the modern world. So for me, writing these books isn't like sort of going back to Tudor England or something. You know, this is very much what shaped our modern world. And the stories of that time and the things that it revealed human beings were capable of, it holds a mirror up to us that is still, I think, vital to look into today. So, you know, I make no apology for occasionally writing books about it. I've only done two, I think, or three. But, you know, I think it's still valid. And I don't try and write them from any point of view of jingoism. You know, the characters in all three of my novels that are partly set in Germany, Enigma, Munich, and now V2, the German characters, the central characters, are sympathetic. Yes. I try to write someone who might be like I might be if I was caught up in that world and that regime.
You were saying earlier that you began as a BBC journalist, and one of the books, if not the first factual book you wrote, was about the Hitler diaries. And again, something I'd almost forgotten about. But again, for anyone watching from wherever in the world you happen to be, may not know about this incredible con. What were the Hitler diaries? Can you remind us?
Yes, the Hitler Diaries scandal happened in 1983, and I've always been interested in that period of time, and indeed in the character of Hitler, and in the media. And so it was just a natural for me. Stern magazine paid out millions of dollars to buy 60, I think, volumes of what was supposed to be Hitler's diaries. It took them several years to accumulate them. They started publishing them, and they sold them all over the world. They sold them to Rupert Murdoch, notably, who put them in the London Sunday Times. And of course, it was ridiculous, absurd. They were forgeries. But people are so interested in Hitler and the Nazis that it was almost like they were prepared to overlook that in the hope that they might get some sort of insight into this person who upended the world. And, you know, at the end of it, it turned out to be the work of a very, very homely kind of forger based down in Stuttgart. And I just couldn't resist it as a story to tell, because you had Murdoch in it, you had the forger, the journalist, you had Hugh Trevor Roper, very brilliant but rather pompous British historian who made a fool of himself by saying the diaries were genuine. It was great. And when I'd finished that, actually, it was so teeming with characters that it was almost a natural step then to start writing Fatherland, which was my first novel.
That's right, and a whiz straight away. It was a bestseller almost straight away. And showing pictures there again of different covers of it. Why? Whenever I've been looking up at your books, everyone seems to have a completely different design cover.
Yes, that cover on the original white cover is a pretty controversial one. It was controversial at the time. It seems even more so now. Yeah, the books go into lots of different editions if you're fortunate, and they're sold around the world, and everybody puts on a different cover. So there's the British hardback, the British paperback, and the American paperback. And yeah, I was incredibly lucky. I was in my first novel, and it just took off. I don't know quite why. The Berlin Wall had not long come down. People were worried about German power, reunified Germany, and it just struck a chord.
And of course, the basis of it was what if the Nazis had won the war, and you'd project, you know, a different sort of history, is that what took you to Hitler's bedroom? When you were
no, it's a rather strange route there. No, I was always interested in the Munich Agreement and Chamberlain's flight to see Hitler, and I always wanted to write a novel about it. And finally, I found a character and the way of doing it. and I set about it. And I went to Munich. I was able to get access to all the places I needed: Downing Street, House of Commons. I saw where Chamberlain's private office was, and so on. And when I went to Munich, not only is the building where the Munich Agreement in 1938, where Hitler met Chamberlain, Mussolini, and Daladier, the French Prime Minister, not only is that still there and almost unchanged, but actually Hitler's apartment in Munich, which he lived in from 1929 until he became Chancellor in 1933. And that is the building, and that is the room where he met Chamberlain the day after the Munich conference and signed the famous piece of paper. And I was lucky enough to get access to it. It's very much off limits. But the head of my publisher in Germany spoke to the Bavarian Interior Minister, and they let me in. And that is Hitler's bedroom. It's now used as a police headquarters, and the police who are there, I think they're an anti-terrorist unit. Their changing room is Hitler's bedroom. And next to Hitler's bedroom is Hitler's bathroom, and adjoining that bathroom is the bedroom of his niece, Gaily Ravel, who shot herself there in 1931, I think, or 31, and he kept it as a shrine. So when Chamberlain went into that apartment building, into the apartment to get Hitler to sign a piece of paper, he passed this shrine to the dictator's dead niece. Very, very odd. But it was the most... I like, if I'm writing the novels, to go and see the places where things happen, because you can still feel, and there in particular, more than almost anywhere else I've been, you could feel the charge in the air. If you go back and look at that picture again briefly, I don't know whether you've got it available, but if you do, you can see that the parquet floor, for instance, yes, and all the look how much of that is actually still... That's what he used to walk on, you can feel the ghost quite easily there.
Oh my God, yes, that's actually really quite spooky, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I mean, your research has taken you all over. We showed earlier a picture of you in Pompeii. That must have been rather nicer to see, actually. And also going to the Vatican, because you do set your novels in these extraordinary places, which just beg to be researched. Who's that with you there?
That is the Monsignor, who is the assistant to the Pope, who, if you see the Pope, there's generally someone fiddling with his microphone or, adjusting it.
Yeah.
I was very, very lucky. I promised myself for a long time that I'd write a novel about the election of a Pope, because I'm so interested in power and elections. I thought this is the ultimate power in election. And so I wrote to the Vatican and asked if I could go and just to see a few places. And it was my good fortune that a writer for my publisher in Italy was working with a senior cardinal on his memoirs, and this journalist showed it to this cardinal, who passed it to the Pope's office. And then, to my astonishment, I got an invitation to come and see whatever I wanted. So I saw the place where the cardinals meet, and they're locked up between votes. And I saw the Vatican Gardens and the Pauline Chapel and the Sistine Chapel. I walked along the corridor and to the doors that open where the new Pope stands on the balcony and sees the hundreds of thousands in St. Peter's Square. I was able to see it all. It's marvelous. I mean, one of the great things about my job is actually getting out of the house and doing that sort of thing that I used to do as a journalist, going and meeting people, seeing things. People are really remarkably open and kind and keen to help. If you just take the trouble to ask, it's remarkable what you're allowed to see.
It's funny that, because we've had a question in from somebody watching at the moment, Alejandra in Austin, who says, I read your book Conclave and really enjoyed it. How do you do research for a topic like that? Did you have direct access to the Vatican? Have you any knowledge of how it was received amongst the cardinals themselves? And did you send a copy of your book to the Pope?
Well, it's interesting. Yes. Well, I've covered how I got in, really, in many ways. And a lot of the actual procedure of what happens is published. I mean, it's a very, very set series of rules and things that people have to go through. So how the votes are organised. And I was able to find some accounts of earlier conclaves. And, it really is a very dramatic couple of days where votes ebb and flow, and I mean, it's just pure politics, actually, but with this great spiritual overlay. And it was a terrific thing to do. you know, I mean, I decided to make the central character the dean of the College of Cardinals, who has to organise the whole election. And it was, I did get a bit of help, and he's dead, and a lovely man. I'm sure he wouldn't mind me telling the story. Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor, who was the cardinal for Great Britain, he read the book. I saw him and talked to him, and he read the book afterwards, and he said it was he very much liked it. He thought it was very accurate in detail. He said the Cardinal Lamelli, my central character, was a cardinal such as all we cardinals would wish to be. And then he said, as for the ending, I just kept telling myself it's only a story. And he said that he did give a copy to the Pope. But I've never had a review, I'm afraid. I've never heard back, so I'm not sure. Maybe I'm not sure what happened. But anyway, I did enjoy writing that book.
Oh, absolutely. And then, of course, you've also seen quite a few of your books now made into movies. How does that work? Do you, as the author, have to just give up the book and let somebody else do with it what they will? Or do you try and keep a handle on what's going on?
Well, it depends. You know, some things are different to others. Enigma, which you're showing there, was written by Tom Stoppard. Mick Jagger was the producer of that. And I was quite closely involved with that. When Tom was writing the screenplay, he used to call me every day pretty well. Others I have hardly anything to do with. Fatherland, for instance, was made by HBO into a TV movie, and I had little to do with that. And can't say honestly that I thought it was great. Archangel had Daniel Craig in it, and that was pretty good, actually. That was a BBC double, kind of 3-4 hours, and I went over and met Daniel Craig when they were filming it. Then more recently, The Ghost, or The Ghostwriter as it was called in America, that was made by Roman Polanski, and that with Ewan McGregor as the ghostwriter and Piers Brosnan as the former Prime Minister, with Kim Cattrall and Olivia Williams in it. And that I wrote the screenplay for. So I was quite involved in that. There they all are. You see, I made the mistake of not getting properly dressed up for the screenplay, and I looked like the gardener on the end there, wandered into this picture. Never be photographed, particularly with Piers Brosnan, as my advice to any man.
You can't win, can you?
No,
but that was a fascinating book in itself, because it was a very thinly veiled caricature or portrayal of one Tony Blair. And frankly, it wasn't terribly it wasn't a great portrayal of a politician. So presumably you're not on his Christmas card list anymore. What happened? You used to get on.
I used to know. That's me. I look terrible in that picture. I think I don't know what's happened to me there. I was sitting on his bus too long, I think, eating too many sandwiches. That's me and Blair. And there in the background, you can see Alistair Campbell inevitably spinning away. Yeah. Yes, I knew Tony pretty well and got on very well with him, actually. I can't say that I supported the Iraq War.
Is that what led to you falling out with him?
Partly that. Partly I was a great friend of Peter Mandelson, who was fired once and then fired again. And the second fire was rather unjust. And so I fell out with Tony Blair over that. And, I realized that very few journalists got the access I did to him when he was just about to be elected Prime Minister in 1997. I traveled around with his campaign, his inner circle, in fact, and was standing next to him when he got the exit poll on the BBC that told him he'd won by a landslide. Yeah. And but it's rare to have that access as a journalist. It's almost, well, it isn't. I don't think any novelist has ever had that access. So, inevitably I was going to use it at some point. And as I say, I didn't believe at all in the Gulf, the invasion of Iraq. And I remember hearing an interview on a radio program where someone said, "Oh, Tony Blair, if he was still Prime Minister, then is going to have to go and live in exile to avoid being prosecuted for war crimes. And for a long time, I'd wanted to write a novel about a ghostwriter because I just thought it was a fascinating character. And I was listening on the car radio, and I practically swerved off the road because I suddenly saw how I could finally make this ghostwriter idea work, that there was a natural thriller there. And I went out to Martha's Vineyard, out of season, just after Thanksgiving, and looked around. And there's nothing like a wintry, mostly abandoned seaside resort. And the whole book kind of gelled in a 1 week research trip, even down to the drive in the hire car from Boston Airport down to the ferry to go over to Martha's Vineyard. It was my first experience of satellite navigation, and I thought I could make this satellite navigation voice a character in the novel. Yes. Which I did. So yeah, it was great fun. And I don't know, I still, oddly enough, do get a Christmas card from Tony Blair. I think I've just been accidentally left on the list, and it still keeps coming.
To make friends again.
And Cherie Blair, I must say, to her credit, she did see the joke of the film, because Olivia Williams, who played the ex-Prime Minister's wife in the movie, saw her at a reception, and Olivia, being as she is, went over to her and said, "Oh, hello, I played you in the film." And Cherie said, "Yes, I saw." She said, I got to sleep with Pierce Brosnan and Ewan McGregor. I rather enjoyed it. So I thought she came out quite well.
It's, again, a not very flattering portrayal of her. So good on Cherie Blair that she's still got a sense of humour about it, I suppose. Mind you, no choice, really. In fact, that brings me to another person with a question. Nicholas in Park Ridge says, how do you choose the topic of your novels? Do people approach you with an idea, or do you ideate it yourself? Is there any untold or true story or episode in history that you really would now like to bring to the world's attention?
Well, it's strange. I don't know. I don't really plan what I'm going to write. I have about 2 or 3 ideas at any one time in my head, and I sort of look at them occasionally and then put them away again. And when I finish a novel, I like to get on and do another one, because I just enjoy the whole process of it. I enjoy being in my own head and in an imaginary world, or researching a book. So I normally go straight from one to another, and it's just a matter of what, as I showed you the obituary there. I read the obituaries a lot these days. They're my favorite thing in a newspaper. I think it's my age. You find a story anywhere in an obituary column, or you see a papal election and you think, I wonder how that happens. There's no, I can't tell you precisely where ideas come from. I write a lot of quite historical books, and they are at the same time contemporary, because I think it's something calls to you from the past, like the fall of the Roman Republic, that has some resonance today. That's why one wants to do it. So it's normally something that's occurred in history, and it calls to you, and you think, that's interesting. I can feel something like that in the air again now. And that's what draws me to the subject.
Yes. Are you a historian by education?
No, my degree is in English, but my wife took history and I took English, and we often say we did the other's degree, really. She's much more interested in English, and I'm much more interested in history.
And she, of course, is a writer as well, Jill Horn.
Yeah.
Comes from a writing family, so it's really in the genes. Your children should be good writers, are they?
Yes, well, certainly one is a writer, one is a publisher. It's nice to see them carrying on with it. Actually, they're all interested in books and films and things like that.
Yeah, well, that's good. You were talking about your interest in certain periods in history, and of course your Cicero trilogy, very famous again, and of course that's ancient Rome. Another good reason to go somewhere nice for research, the Vatican and all that. So yes, you must have found yourself in Rome a fair few times.
Yes, I mean, I've written 14 novels of them. 5 of them are set in Italy, oddly enough. The 3 Cicero novels. Not that there was much point in going to Italy to research them, because these are set, like 50, 60 years BC. And that Rome it really has gone. I mean, there's bits around the Forum and so on, but most of the Rome that we know is Augustan or later. So there wasn't much to see. Whereas for Pompeii, of course, there was a lot to see, and I spent a very happy couple of winters down on the Bay of Naples, researching, in inverted commas, whilst my wife grappled with 4 young children back in England. That was a wonderful book to research, and then of course Conclave. So I've done quite a lot in Italy. I've eaten a lot of pasta. It's been very pleasant.
Yes, very nice.
I mean, and having done a novel in Bletchley Park, which the suburb of Milton Keynes, nothing against Milton Keynes, I might say, but I must say the Bay of Naples beats the Milton Keynes quite handily as a place to go and set a novel.
Not off, absolutely. I was saying to you earlier that you're a typical man. I asked you for a photograph of yourself with your wife Jill and the family, and you've managed to find one that's quite an old photograph, I think. But there's the family.
Yes, the family and the dog, beloved dog, alas now gone. Yes, I just wanted to find one where we were all together, and there we are. Now they've all left home. It's a very strange feeling. I mean, I think nothing ever prepares you for your children leaving. I mean, that phase of life, which you think is going to go on forever, and there were quite a lot of us here, and then suddenly it's over. It's a very haunting, strange time, and all the more reason actually to keep on writing novels.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the only thing a lot of people do when their children fly the nest, I'm in the same situation, is travel. And that's something that, quite weirdly, we just can't do at the moment. It's very frustrating.
No, and I mean, I'm fortunate in a way in that I can travel in my head and visit different periods and different places. And I mean, that is a form of pleasure to me, and does substitute in some way for actually physically going somewhere. People during the lockdown, and which is now returned here in England, they say, oh, this is ideal for you as a novelist, surely, because your life is locked down anyway. And that is true. I mean, I've written all except Fatherland, all my novels have been written in this room, sitting at this spot. Nothing changes really. Yes, I'm very fortunate. We live in an old Victorian Gothic vicarage.
It's absolutely lovely room. It's
paid for by Fatherland, the house that Hitler bought, as it became known to my friends. Bad taste joke. So yeah, I mean, I'm very lucky. I sit there and that's where I work. But to write. Stephen King has a wonderful phrase. A lot of writing, he says, is done by the boys in the basement, and that is your subconscious. And I write in the mornings and then stop at lunchtime. And it's in the rest of the day, walking the dog, going to the shops, seeing friends, having lunch in a pub or whatever. It's in that time that a lot of writing is done, that period of recreation when your mind solves problems and you wake up the next morning and you think you have fresh impetus to go on and carry on writing. That went in lockdown. I mean, I think everyone who went through it remembers those strange, long, uneasy sleeps that we had and the weird dreams, and then the next day not being able to go anywhere. That's not good for writing, actually. Yeah, you're confined in this place. There's nothing else to do. To that extent, you get on with it. But once, somehow it was a strain to write V2. I both enjoyed it but it was a feat of will, and in a funny way, it's perhaps not for me to say, but in a funny way, I think the book actually benefits from it, partly because it was a wartime atmosphere. We were all in this together. Our ordinary lives that we'd taken for granted suddenly turned upside down, as if it was 1914 or 1939 all over again. That sense of the death toll mounting. A certain fear in the air, let's face it. So I think that permeated the novel, and also I wrote the novel very tight, actually, and I had to really think hard and imagine these places where it's set, because, frankly, apart from the coast of Holland, the woods there from which the rockets were fired at London, I went there at the end of last year, but the other places, it was impossible to travel. So I really had to imagine them very hard, use Google Maps and Google Earth and all those sorts of resources and really concentrate. And in a funny way, as I say, it's for the reader to judge, I think the book is more vivid as a result.
Reads great to me, really does. Munich, of course, another of your books.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to drag a compliment out.
No, you don't have to drag it. It's a brilliant book. I mean, I'm thoroughly enjoying it, as I do with all of your books. Munich, as I mentioned, you said you were always fascinated by the Munich Agreement and Chamberlain's dilemma and all the rest of it, the piece of paper, and that is at the moment being filmed.
Yes, it is. It's being filmed by Netflix, and yes, Jeremy Irons is playing Neville Chamberlain. You see him there, which is a dream casting, actually. Yeah. Most of the time in the film world and the TV world, it's a world of great frustration for having a novel turned into a film. But just occasionally it works, because I knew Jeremy Irons, know him slightly, and when I wrote Munich, I sent it to him 3 years ago and said, "What do you think?" And he wrote back immediately and said, "Yes, count me in."
Ooh.
And after 3 years, project dropped by one company, taken up by another, finally he's there and doing it. So, you know, for once things worked. And, you know, I can't wait to see what his performance is like. There are other very good actors in it. The hero, Hugh Leggett, who was Chamberlain's private secretary, fictional character, he's played by George Mackay, who's in 1917. He's the young actor, the lead in that. So, you know, I mean, they're filming it in very difficult circumstances with the pandemic. Most of it is filmed it's a half German, half English production, but they have 7,000 testing kits, and the cast and the crew are tested every day. So, you know, it's quite something. And only a company really like Netflix has the power to take something like that on, to insure it for a start, you know. And we all are hoovering up entertainment. But it's quite hard to make it. So, you know, this is a new thing that's actually being made during this period. So it'll be interesting to see how it turns out.
Do you know when it's going to be completed and released?
I think it's sort of September-ish next year, something like that. I think is the plan. Yeah, but they're up to their neck filming it now. Normally, I would go out and see a film being made, but you know, it's impossible to do that this time.
Yes, absolutely. Talking of which, James in Philadelphia says, "How did Mr. Harris get on with Polanski, if he needed to, for Ghostwriter? I loved the film," he says.
Well, it's very, you know, that was 2007, I first started working with Polanski. He wanted to make a film of Pompeii, which would have been interesting, and I did the screenplay of that, but that fell through. And whilst I was writing that screenplay, I wrote my novel, The Ghost, and I sent it to him as a sort of joke, actually, and said, maybe we should make this instead, no volcanoes, no togas. Yeah. And he got back in touch and said, yes, let's do it. I want to do a thriller. This is great. And so, yeah, eventually it was made, came out in 2010. And he's recently made another film of a novel of mine, An Officer and a Spy. Of course, the Me Too movement and controversy has swamped his career since and rendered him pretty well unemployable. And the film is not being shown in Britain and America. It was #1 in the French box office, but he's persona non grata, and so that's vanished. What was he like to work with? I enjoyed it. I mean, he's had a most extraordinary life. He managed to escape being sent to Auschwitz, went on the run in wartime Poland. His father was sent to Majdanek camp. His mother died in Auschwitz. And then, of course, his wife, Sharon Tate, was murdered by the Manson family. And he is kind of almost the history of the last 70, 80 years is there in him, in fact. Yeah. So, yeah, no, I found him interesting to work with.
Certainly must be what makes him a good director, whatever else. Poonam says, because of watching Viking television, I have just ordered your V2. It's just arrived. I'm going to enjoy reading it, especially after this interview. That's a nice one. Adiane in the US says, do you have a research assistant or do you do everything yourself?
Well, that's an interesting question. Actually, I do all the research. I've never hired a researcher at all. It means that a lot of my time is spent poring over things which I won't ever even use. But as I'm not drawing my novels from my own direct experience, I feel that the research is the lived life, as it were. I have to go through all that to be able to find my story and the characters. And so while I'm churning through something which I'm probably never going to put in a novel, connections are going on and being made in my mind. And if someone else was doing that research, I wouldn't be able to see things because it's in the tiny, tiny details that the story, for me at any rate, is often found. So I do it all myself and always have done. And usually the research files, word for word, are 3 or 4 times as long as the finished book, because I feel that if I know 10 things and only use one of them, somehow the reader can sense that you know the other 9 as well. And the thing you have to do if you're doing a historical novel, it seems to me, is there comes a point when you've researched it so much that you throw away the research and then you just write the story. And the worst kind of historical novels for me are the ones where the author is constantly trying to wave their research in front of your face and, it slows the whole thing down. You shouldn't. You should write about a historical scene as freely as you might write about a modern scene. I always think about the example of, say, a character walking down Oxford Street now. You would say, he walked down towards Bond Street Tube, past Selfridges, heading east or something. You wouldn't write, he walked down past Selfridges, was opened in 1904 by Gordon Selfridge, the American millionaire, towards Bond Street tube station. The tube was built, you know what I mean? Yeah. That's what you get often in a historical novel. You don't. You just want to go. He walked past the Forum, sort of thing, in the direction of the Colosseum.
I don't know where you got some of those experiences from then, because I've just gone past the bit where I don't think I'm spoiling anything by saying one of the rockets blows up, and your character says he's met by a wall of soil, and the way you describe it, being almost in the center of an explosion, is very, very graphic. You can't have gone through that yourself, or you wouldn't have survived.
No, this is where the research comes in. This is where, if you read enough accounts of the rocket troops who fired the V2s at London, who've almost never been written about or interviewed that I can see. I only found one collection of interviews with them. But in those descriptions, you've got a picture of their life. Harried by Allied bombers, out in the dripping cold woods along the coastal strip of Holland, firing these missiles at London, highly unstable, with about 10 tons of unstable fuel in it. So the liquid alcohol, methyl alcohol, incidentally, they used to drain off. It was dyed purple to try and put them off. But even so, a lot of the men used to take it and pass it through the carbon filters of their gas masks and then drink it, so that they would be completely kind of blot out. In those details lies your novel. Yes. And similarly, on the other side, in London, the V2 would hit London at a speed of nearly 3 times the speed of sound, about 2,000 miles an hour. So it was physically impossible to see it coming in. And people who survived it said that there used to be a slight change in the air pressure, almost a beat of silence and a strange crack in the ear almost, and then they would hear, then there'd be the sonic boom, and then the crash of the explosion as the bomb exploded, and then only then would you hear the rush of the noise of the incoming rocket. The most peculiar thing. And these were hitting London, sometimes 5 or 6 a day. And the noise, this double boom of sound barrier being broken and then the explosion, was heard right across London.
I mean, a bomb is frightening enough, but just those things that you've described, a slight sense of change in the air pressure, and then kaboom. I mean, that makes it more terrifying, knowing those little details, doesn't it?
It does. It does. And it does bring home to you. I mean, you know, these horrendous knife attacks that have been in London, the terrorist incidents, you know, which rightly spread great fear. Imagine 5 of them a day, and actually they're a kind of space-age rocket plunging down, and you don't know where it's going to hit, and it's completely unstoppable, and it carries a 1-ton warhead. And a lot of these, of course, fell pretty harmlessly, you know, onto playing fields or into fields, woodland. But some of them had hit with terrible accuracy onto buildings. I mean, the opening of V2 has the worst incident of the war for the V2, where one hit the Woolworths department store in Deptford on Saturday lunchtime. And the store had just had a consignment of saucepans delivered. This was at the end of November 1944. And word had got around among all the housewives locally, and they'd all flooded towards this very big Woolworths, 4 stories, and taken their children as well, who were all around the, you know, kind of the sweet counter, candy counter. And this V2 struck it dead center of the roof, plowed right the way down and exploded. And on the bus and the street outside, all the passengers were found dead, sitting upright in their chairs. They'd been traumatized by the shockwave, the blast. And that was 160 people killed in an instant by one of these rockets. And that one is actually, I described the firing of that one in the novel. So I printed deliberately in the book all the V2 hit strikes on London are the ones that actually occurred, and I put the names of some of the victims in, just to try and honor them and make the point that, you know, these were real lives. You know, this was an extraordinary technological feat, and at the end of it, it killed women and children mainly.
Like you said, the fear all the time as well, because of course we know now that the war did end, but they weren't to know that it wasn't going to go on for years and years like that.
Well, I think this was part of the thing about the V2. People had been through the Blitz in 1940 and 1941. They'd had the doodle bugs, the kind of jet, the kind of pilotless bombs, which the engine cut out and they would fall. Yeah. And you would think that maybe that, hearing this droning noise and then the silence and knowing that it's coming down somewhere near you, you would have thought that might be the most frightening. But at least you did have time to try and get under a table or get some undercover somewhere. With the V2, you simply had no warning whatever. There was nothing. And a lot of the social histories of London during the war, a lot of the people said that the V2 was the worst thing, because they were exhausted. You know, they'd had now more than 5 years of war, and here it goes again. And not only that, it's some futuristic kind of weapon that the world had never seen before. So it did make people wonder, what maybe the Germans aren't beaten after all. And I think it had a profound effect, and it caused an immense amount of damage. The V2, because it struck the ground so hard at such a speed and detonated underground quite often, the shockwave spread out a 1/4 mile radius and damaged a lot of buildings. Cracked the foundations, broke the windows, and astonishingly 600,000 buildings were either damaged or, in some way or other, or destroyed by the V2s. And the post-war housing crisis in England, a lot of it, especially in London, was caused by the V2, this 6 or 7 months when they were being fired at London.
And didn't Hitler say that, he was very pleased once he was shown it, and if only he'd had it a couple of years earlier, he would have just walked through Europe?
Well, that's right. The Germans put an enormous amount of money into developing these rockets, the same amount of money, literally, as the Americans spent on the atomic bomb, and in a much smaller economy, the German economy. Werner von Braun, the rocket scientist who developed the V2, who appears in the novel, interesting character to write, he was not only a brilliant engineer, he was also a brilliant salesman. And he, after the first successful test flight of the prototype V2, which, bear in mind, went into low space, about 60 miles high, and flew 200 miles in 5 minutes. An incredible thing. It was the first time that mankind had been, had put anything into space, and it broke the sound barrier as well, which was another first. He went to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia with a movie film of this first flight, and showed it to Hitler in a private cinema Hitler had there, and Hitler watched it transfixed. And this was just after the disaster at Stalingrad, when he realized that the war was going to be lost, and he needed something to turn the tide. And this young, dynamic engineer turned up with this footage, and he ordered 10,000 of these V2s on the spot to be built, and made von Braun a professor immediately. And he said, if we had had this in 1939, no one could have stopped us. No one would have dared try to stand up to us. It was a crazy decision. There was no way the V2 was going to win the war for Germany. It carried a 1-ton warhead. A Lancaster heavy bomber carried 6 tons of high explosive. So it wasn't a war-winning weapon. But in a furious state, no one dares say no to the boss. Yes. And so they went ahead and built the V2 with enormous loss of life. 5 times as many people died building the V2 as were killed by the V2, because they built a huge factory in Nordhausen using slave labor. An astonishing feat, very near to the end of the war. And they were building V2 one every 90 minutes. An astonishing thing. This is such a sophisticated piece of equipment, but it was hopeless.
When you were researching it, you must have you knew it was a good idea to start with, which is what set you off with your research at the beginning. But as you discovered more and more of these astonishing, alarming facts, you must have thought, wow, this is a gold mine, and this story's never been told.
Well, it is one of those things. When if you're lucky with a book, that you find it's better than you thought it was going to be. I had that feeling with Conclave, actually, that it was a richer human drama than I could ever possibly hope before I started. I felt the same about An Officer and a Spy, my novel about the Dreyfus affair. And yes, I would put V2 in the same category, because there's various levels to it. There's this Faustian bargain, really, between the rocket scientists, young men. Insofar as they had politics, it was mainly liberal left. There weren't many Nazis among them, but their bargain was with the devil. In order to build their space rocket, which is what they wanted to build, they had to take the money from the German army. And then when the thing flew, and it coincided with Stalingrad, suddenly they became the creatures of the SS who took over the whole project. And that sort of moral decline fascinated me, and I had no idea when I started writing the novel that would be such a strong feature of it. So on the German side you have that, and on the British you have this the rain of bombs on their head, and then the attempts using this crazy idea in many ways of calculating the curve of the rocket. If you knew where it had landed in London, you had high-looking radar, so you could just briefly glimpse it after it was launched from the coast of Holland. Then, using these 2 pieces of information, these 8 women in a bank vault in Mechelen in Belgium had to calculate where it had come from, because the parabolic curve is a ballistic missile. There's an iron law of mathematics that says where it should originate. And if they could make that calculation within 6 minutes, then the RAF could scramble fighters in Norfolk and get them over the Dutch coast before the Germans could get away, dismantle the mobile launch sites in the woods. So there was a sort of ticking clock and a race against time. And so it was, as you say, it's not really been written about in fiction very much. And it is an extraordinarily rich subject. So it was fascinating to work on it.
And von Braun was only 31 at the time. I mean, these young, terrific brains, weren't they?
Yeah, they were just teenagers, really, fooling around with rockets on waste ground to the north of Berlin. And they were commissioned by Fritz Lang, the movie director, who made a film called Woman in the Moon, Frau im Mond. And the studio thought it would be a good gimmick to fire a rocket, a little rocket, to encourage press coverage of the movie. The rocket never materialized, but they carried on with their researchers, and they did start to make curious homemade rockets, which often, hit police stations or, went through suburban areas. And this came to the attention of the German army, partly through von Braun's father, because his father was an aristocrat who was actually in the government. He was Minister of Agriculture in the government just before Hitler came to power, and the army started taking a look. And then suddenly, this accident of timing again, Hitler comes to power, and money is no object for the German army. Suddenly, they were constricted in how much air force they could develop, and indeed military expansion. But rockets weren't covered by the Versailles Treaty because no one had thought of rockets. So that became an area that they could quite legally research. And so suddenly von Braun and these kids, still only in their early 20s, had all the money they wanted. And when they found this Baltic island, this Peenemünde place, a sort of virgin kind of forest, marsh, sandy coves and beaches, the German armed forces just bought it for them. And they built, in the end, a rocket city, which they'd always dreamed of doing, which is in the Fritz Lang movie. From the Fritz Lang movie, incidentally, is where we get the 10, 9, 8, 7, 6 countdown. That was Fritz Lang's idea in the movie, which the scientists at Peenemünde, the rocket engineers, borrowed for their launches, and which was then taken up by NASA. That all goes back to these kids, building these kind of toys in a way.
Mika in Montclair in the United States says, I was in Holland during the Second World War and heard the V2 roaring over our heads constantly. And if you heard a plop, we knew that it was defective and came down somewhere between us and the North Sea instead of London. No big deal for Nazi-occupied Holland. Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah, well, I think it was something like 1 in 10 of the rockets misfired. I mean, it was a prototype which had been rushed into production, and they were shipped by rail from central Germany under cover of darkness to The Hague, to the Dutch coast, and then they were taken into the woods covered in tarpaulins and fired very quickly. But the technology was very unstable, highly advanced, and there were a lot of problems, so the rockets would blow up on the launch pad, or they would sometimes they would fly in the wrong direction and actually land in civilian areas in Holland. Quite a lot of Dutch civilians were killed, and the eyewitnesses said they used to, as the person who got in touch, I'm sure would remember that they all prayed every time they heard this ear-splitting roar, which was said to be the loudest noise ever made on Earth, those rockets, because of the huge weight of fuel that was being burnt every second. The noise carried, so they heard the thing being fired up, and they would see it shoot up. It would be, and at 4 seconds into its flight, it would tilt towards London and disappear into the clouds. And it was with a great relief that I think that they often saw it disappear into the clouds, because it meant it wasn't going to fall back on them. This whole area, a kind of mile or two wide, this strip of coast was cleared of civilians, but all that, those who were living nearby, they could hear it pretty clearly.
2 very quick questions before I let you go, because we've been talking and talking, which has been fascinating. Can you tell me how long it took to research the book, and then how long to write?
Well, as I say, I found the story about 4 years ago, and I put it in the back of my mind, and then occasionally I would do a bit of research, but really concentrated hard research, I would say about 8 months. And then to write, I try and write my books in 6 months if I can. And so that's about what it took me from January this year until the end of June. That's a pretty standard time for me to write.
Which authors do you most like to read? Which ones do you most admire and why?
Well, I'm a great admirer of Graham Greene and Georges Simenon. I admire that sort of very well written, but at the same time entertaining, accessible book about something often quite big, but is in a narrow focus. So those are favourite authors. George Orwell is another favourite author of mine. My favourite genre of reading these days is not so much fiction, because I get enough of that in my working life, as it were, but I love reading memoirs, not memoirs, I'm sorry, diaries or journals or letters, things that are unmediated history, without a historian standing between me and the voice of the people in the past. I mean, I find that fascinating. So whenever I can get hold of any kind of journal, doesn't matter who it is or what their life is, but that sense of someone recording their daily life, not knowing how their own story is going to end, that I find fascinating.
Do you do that? Do you keep a diary?
Yeah, from time to time, yes, I do. And it's mainly a record of work, because I just sit here, and I have done now for nearly 30 years. I find I need to keep some kind of record of my daily labour, because otherwise it just simply vanishes. And when I'm in a bad spot with a book, I can always look back at all the other times I've been in a bad spot with a book and think, well, I got through it before, and hopefully I'll get through it again.
What usually breaks through that sort of writer's cramp, or whatever you call it?
You have to take a deep breath sometimes and stand back from it and plot it through to the end. You have to be careful. You can't have too detailed a plan, because then the book becomes dead. And anyway, you find that characters don't do what you thought they might do when they actually come to it. But it is very useful, I think, to know how a book will end and to work backwards from that, so that the reader has a sense that there's a purpose for what they're being told. Otherwise, it's like someone embarking on telling you a joke and they don't know the punchline. You get a kind of rambling story, and you're bored. Yeah. Yes, people shift in their seats,
There's a lot of that around at the moment in the sort of television that is being made, being churned out. You think, well, this is good. There's a beginning, and sometimes there's a middle, and then they just don't seem to have a proper ending at all.
No, the worst thing, actually, I mean, it's brilliant, I think, television at the moment, the series, the talent that's going into it, it's superb. It's at the heart of our culture, far more, really, let's face it, than novels are. People talking about, the Queen's Gambit or whatever the latest series is on Netflix, Ordinary People or whatever. But quite often then when you go to the second or the third series, the whole idea is collapsed, because it's lost its raison d'etre. It's just become, a commercial thing that everyone gets paid quite a lot, and it's a brand. And that's the curse of our age. We both get a brilliant first season by and large, and occasionally second, and then the whole thing becomes a law of diminishing returns.
Well, you're going to go on. Presumably, you've got an awful lot more books in you yet. Have you started the new one?
I'm thinking about it, and I'm reading and researching for it. There isn't much else I can do, quite frankly, and I'm enjoying it. And I should just go on doing it as long as people want to read them. I certainly want to go on writing them.
Oh, you betcha. Well, I don't need to wish you luck with V2, because it's fantastic, and it's out now, as it says there, and it really is a riveting read. Thank you so much for coming on Viking Television today and talking about it. It's been great to have you, and it's been lovely to see inside your study.
Thanks, Anne. I've really enjoyed it as well.
Oh, good. No, it's been really brilliant. I shall get on and read the rest of it now. Thank you very much. Robert Harris, thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Bon voyage, I should say.
Yeah, absolutely. One hopes quite soon. Well, there we are. That's Robert Harris, who joined us there from his home here in the UK in lockdown, but making it a very productive lockdown by the sound of it. Now, next week, I'm going to be talking about Christmas. Unashamedly, actually, because we'll be finding out about a Christmas tradition that happens every 10 years in the Bavarian village of Oberammergau. it hosts a very special production of the Passion Play. And next week I'll be interviewing Frédéric Meillet, who was raised in Oberammergau, giving him and other residents born or living in the town the right to take part in the play. As well as being cast in the role of Jesus, got the big part, in the next production, Frédéric is responsible for the PR and marketing of the production as well, and he'll be able to tell us all about the play's history, which dates back to 1633. And he'll be talking about how the text has evolved over the centuries, responding to the politics of the time. So that's something to look forward to next week. Thanks to Robert Harris for joining us this week. And between then and now, please stay safe and stay happy and have a good time, even if you are maybe in lockdown yourselves. We'll be here for you next Thursday. Until then, stay safe and well. Bye-bye.